BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Friday, another Anything Goes Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? Hope you guys are all well. First, I would like to give a shout out to Will Holst, who wrote into the channel saying, I would love to hear a Black Box episode on the Columbine shooting. I don't know if you ever got into that case, but it is very interesting. And as you see, this is a topic that was requested by one of the listeners, so if you have an idea for a future episode on the Anything Goes Friday segment, or maybe you're curious about some of the ongoing true crime discussions here on this channel, you can put your idea in the comments section down below, and maybe there will be an episode on your proposed topic in the near future. And just some reminders and announcements before we truly begin. The first is that there has been a new segment added to Black Box Online Radio, and that is the Wednesday show, now covering Jack the Ripper. And there's going to be a regular segment on Jack the Ripper for the foreseeable future on Wednesdays. And on the weekends, I've been doing an ongoing series about JonBenet Ramsey and her murder from 1996. And of course, every Monday is Zodiac Monday, where I'm talking to you guys about the Zodiac Killer. And if anybody would like to support these efforts, the absolute best way is just by listening to the channel and leaving comments down below. But also, you can share with your friends and family on social media. If you know someone who is curious about true crime cases or about just other aspects of psychology, or even some of the more technical ones, like when I did the episode on Alexander Litvinenko and polonium poisoning. If you know people who are just curious about these events in human history, you can share with your friends and family on social media. And another great way to help out the channel is to go over to BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88. There's a link to that in the description box. BuyMeACoffee.com allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the program, and anyone who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Mondays. So Will has written, I don't know if you ever got into that case, but it is very interesting. With the Columbine shooting, I definitely was around when the early news coverage came out. I was actually sick from school on the day of the Columbine shooting. I think I was in the 5th grade, and I was just watching TV because I was sick at home. I believe I was on the couch, just kind of like curled up in a ball, and there was this breaking news story that there had been a school shooting. But from the beginning, we could tell that this wasn't just a typical news story. The amount of press and coverage really showed us that there was something much more threatening involved with the Columbine shooting, as well as the shooters, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, who are more or less household names. Even people who are not close followers of the true crime world know about Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. And I think there are 2 reasons for that. The first is we have an enormous amount of media about Columbine. There's all of the news camera footage of the events taking place after the shooting, as well as home videos that have been recorded by the 2 shooters. But also because this particular school shooting ignited a nationwide discussion on bullying, as well as how do people respond to it, coping mechanisms, and also for the victims, the grieving process, and how people had to respond to the tragedies and the trauma of experiencing the Columbine shooting. So I would like to go over to the website, which is simply called acolumbinesite.com, and it says that Wednesday, April 21st, 1999, 6:15 a.m. local time, Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris show up for school as per norm. Harris in a shirt that reads Natural Selection. 11 a.m. Harris and Klebold are wearing wraparound shades and black trench coats as they arrive back on campus and head toward the Columbine High cafeteria. 11:15 a.m. Reports began to come in of 2 or 3 masked gunmen entering the school, which had about 2,000 students. Matthew Dupuis, son of one of the officers, made the first call from the kitchen. Hidden so close to the killers, he could hear them reloading their guns. The 2 gunmen began firing in the parking lot, killing Rachel Scott with a bullet to the head. Danny Rorbo was next to fall just outside the entrance. From there, they closed in on the cafeteria, where they threw pipe bombs as well as shot at fleeing students, and then up to the library, bombing in their wake. Later reports suggested that they picked on ethnic minorities and jocks, a slang term for athletic types. An hour after the shooting began, television cameramen were on the scene, relaying images nationwide and then worldwide. SWAT teams in black fatigues were on the scene at 12:30 p.m., over an hour after the shooting began. They initially believed that they were dealing with a hostage-taking situation. The first team of 5 people began sweeping on the upper level, stopping the closed doors in the halls and separating them from the science rooms, choir room, and library because they were afraid of booby traps. About 20 students were freed. At this point, they were unsure whether the gunmen were alive and in the building. At around 1:30, an armored car was brought to the main school entrance for cover as dozens more students fled the building. Around 2:00 p.m., 3 youths wearing black clothes but not trench coats were apprehended by armed police in a field near the school. The trio were later described as friends of the gunmen. They were later questioned and then released. 2:30 p.m. local time, 2 SWAT teams entered the teacher's lounge next to the kitchen and began securing the lower level by freeing kids in the kitchen and bathrooms, searching them before the uninjured were released to their parents. And the parents wandered about the nearby Clement Park Hospital trying to find their children, while students stood shaking and crying. Police helicopters whirled overhead, and hundreds of police officers patrolled the school as confusion reigned. Steve Davis, a spokesman for the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, announced that police were looking for 2 suspects, but said it was not clear whether or not they were in the building. At around 4:30 p.m., police found 2 suspects shot dead in the library. Wounds were apparently self-inflicted, and their bodies were close enough to each other to touch. One of the 2 was found laying on the pistol, but still covered in ammunition and explosives. They were surrounded by the other 10 students they killed. At around the same time, Sheriff John Stone said the death toll appeared to be up to 25. Police declared the site secure. And as we'll see, that death toll is not accurate. At around 4:30 p.m., the SWAT team began a slow sweep of the building looking for survivors. 6:15 p.m., authorities find and disarm several car bombs in the school parking lot. 10:30 p.m., a bomb on a timer blows up and no one is injured. Wednesday morning, the death toll was revised to 15 and then to 13, discovered that several bodies were booby-trapped. And no comment on that last one, but yes, of course, the death toll was definitely revised down from 25. So I noticed some things from watching documentaries about the Columbine shooting, and that is that almost immediately, everybody who was interviewed who had connections to Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold had 2 things to say about these boys. The first is that they were bullied, and the second is that neither one of them had a girlfriend ever. And back in 2011, I watched a couple documentaries about this one, and I just thought it was so shocking that immediately everybody was focusing on the bullying aspect, as opposed to people also stating that there's this lack of intimacy and approval and integration into normal society and social groups that these 2 were experiencing. That by no means is a justification for what they did. Let's be very clear. The killers were wrong. But when discussing the psychological aspects behind this particular mass shooting, it seems very apparent that these two were very alienated. And another strong point to be partnered with that is manipulation, because almost all parties are in agreement that Eric Harris was the stronger member of this duo. The word dyad is also used sometimes, social dyad, that he was the stronger participant only in terms of his ability to manipulate. That doesn't necessarily mean he was more intelligent or he had a higher IQ. I don't know what their IQs were, and I don't really care, to be honest. What I think is more important is that he was the more manipulative and definitely the more deranged of these two individuals. Because people ask this question all the time in the comment section on Black Box Online Radio. They say, what kind of person would get a friend to commit a murder with them? What kind of person would be able to convince somebody to commit murder on their behalf or go along with their plan to murder somebody? And this is a perfect example of how that can happen, of how someone can be either manipulated or coerced or coaxed or deceived in some way into joining somebody else's murder plan. And it comes to a certain point when you have to put some responsibility on Dylan Klebold, because this is how the legal system will look at the particular situation. They will say, did this person have the opportunity to say no? Did this person have the opportunity to walk away? Did this person have the opportunity to stop the shooting? Did this person have the opportunity to alert the authorities about Eric Harris's behavior? And the fact that he actually went along with all of these steps makes him very guilty. It just means that he was a vulnerable person, but he was also very deranged in his own right. And I don't want to downplay this connection to both bullying and the lack of intimacy in their lives, as well as the lack of integrating into the social groups. Like, all of that, I think, are contributing factors. There was a story that I heard about them. Again, this was when I was watching some episodes about Columbine back in 2011. And the story was that Eric and Dylan were walking down the hallway in their school, and then somebody who was referred to as a jock just pushed Eric out of the way, and he didn't say, hey, what's going on, or just like he didn't appear shocked at all. It was so normal. It was such a normal occurrence to be literally, physically pushed around by other people that he didn't bat an eyelash. But recently, I was watching a documentary on the Real Crime Channel. This was actually yesterday, that was done years later. And it also talked about how Eric Harris had this psychological way of holding on to grudges, and I believe the term that they used was damage inventory, where he did not forgive and he did not look past any of these mistakes, and he didn't try to move on. Instead, he held on to the bad experiences, and he remembered them, and he would ruminate in them. And then he was just waiting for the opportune moment to get revenge on all the people who have wronged him. But that same film made a very strong statement by saying that Eric Harris had genuine psychopathic tendencies. And their presentation on psychopathic tendencies, I thought, was rather odd. Again, this was from the Real Crime Channel, available here on YouTube. And what they said about Eric Harris was that he had the ability to put on a nice, gentle facade, but he was also using it as an extremely unsophisticated manipulation tactic, because people could see through that. Like, he would just look people in the eye, be very nice and gentle, apologize, oh, I'm sorry, okay, it won't happen again. And then when people would recognize that he was lying, when they would catch him in a lie, and when people would be able to cut through his manipulation, the exact description of it was that he would just turn red and he would just explode with anger, even if he isn't completely going to the point of committing a shooting in those specific instances. He's not homicidal, but he is being very angry and giving the signs that would lead toward the homicidal behavior that was expressed at Columbine. But the reason why I talked about the lack of intimacy in their lives was because their peers were talking about that. And I think that the term intimacy is probably going to be a little bit misleading. I also think it's that both of them strongly felt that they were not going to get the approval of their peers, particularly from women, particularly that they were not going to be favored by women, and they reached a point of hopelessness, to the point where they just thought that this is the only way to end things. I'm never going to be loved, and I feel misery, therefore I want other people around us to feel misery. And they even talked about how Eric Harris made calculations that the explosives in the cafeteria were going to murder 450 people, and since the shooting, it has been revealed that he was making these calculations by constantly trying to count the number of students that were coming in and out of the cafeteria, how many were in there at any given time. So there's an enormous amount of thought and planning and calculation that went into the Columbine shooting to the benefit of the students. His explosives didn't always work, and you even heard from the timeline there that one of the explosives wasn't even detonated until hours after the shooting took place and no one was harmed. So they were unsuccessful in that regard, and that is a very good thing. But I also want to zone in on a particular aspect of the Columbine shooting. You heard when I was reading off the timeline of events that Eric Harris was wearing a shirt that said natural selection, and it has also been talked about how they targeted specific people because of race. There's even the story of how they approached an African American named Isaiah, and they said, hey, the N-word is over here, or there's an N-word, something to that effect, and that he was targeted because he was black. And I don't think that that had any real foundations in their ideology. Absolutely not. I mean, yes, they were homicidal. Yes, they did say that. But I don't think that either one of them had any genuine belief about racism or natural selection or Adolf Hitler. Why? Why do I say that? Because I used to be a teenager and I used to be around people who would say really dumb things, and they didn't believe a word of it. They were just frustrated because they didn't have power over other people in their lives. They were frustrated because they were 16 or 17 or 18, and they wanted to be in control of all things, and they thought they had ideas, and they thought they knew what they were talking about, but they didn't. And they didn't have the ability to change things. They didn't have the ability to manipulate other people. So instead of trying to improve their own lives, they would start creating these types of emotional scapegoats where they would blame different types of people for their shortcomings, or he was just a target for emotions such as anger and frustration. And of course, rejection and the lack of intimacy, they start ignoring their own flaws and just blaming other people because they're different. This happens very frequently with people who are racist or even anti-Semitic, the way that Eric Harris was also reported to have been. So, I mean, it's not really grounded in any defendable ideology or philosophy or belief system. It's just a frustrated teenager, which turns it into two frustrated teenagers who were not desired by their peers. Now, there's something, though, that I think needs to be included into this particular discussion, and that involves a series of home movies that were made with Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. I mean, that's what we called them back in the day. Right now, we would just say, like, oh yeah, they recorded some videos together. We used to use the term home movies because you had to record on some type of film that was usually put into your VCR, and, you know, people had camcorders, and we called them home movies. I think you get the idea. And I remember one of them that I was watching, in the documentaries, of course, where Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold are just trying to be silly and funny, and he says, I'll shove your head so far up your ass, you'll be coughing up dandruff for weeks. And I actually laughed at that the first time I heard that. And then there are some other disturbing ones of them shooting guns and, like, doing target practice in the woods, but there are multiple videos of them just going around and laughing and having a good time. And I thought, why wasn't that enough? Why wasn't that enough? And the honest answer is psychologically deranged people, homicidal tendencies, not just homicidal ideation, no, not just thinking about it, about exerting and expressing destructive tendencies in the external world. Ideation, that's in the mind. We're talking about homicidal tendencies and the choice to bring pain and misery to other people because of mental instability. Number two, because of the inability to have power over other people. Number three, because of fluctuating elements of brain chemistry, particularly dopamine, and the inability to have control over emotions. And of course, the fourth would be sense of entitlement, believing that certain types of behaviors would be reserved only for him, Eric Harris, that he had the right to behave in a certain way. He had the right to unleash his angry outbursts onto other people, but other people did not have the right to respond to him in any undesirable way. So there is some sense of immature and entitled behavior in this case as well. And I know it's a weird thought, but when I was watching them in their home movies, not the ones with guns, but just the ones when they're laughing and having a good time, I just thought, these guys just could have graduated high school. They could have just either tolerated whatever was they were experiencing, and then they could have gone on to become filmmakers or something, or they could have gone on to become entertainers. But they chose not to do that. They chose to end their own lives as well as the lives of other people because of selfishness, because of mental instability. And it showed, once you hear the stories about that whole thing, counting the number of people in the lunchroom regularly to detonate the bomb, that is a calculating decision. That means that these two people were in complete control of their mental faculties. And, it just goes to show that even though their lives were perhaps not very desirable, even though their lives were somewhat miserable, even though they did deal with real conflicts such as bullying, they did not handle the issues in a responsible way. They decided to use their mental energy for a destructive purpose, as opposed to a constructive purpose. Okay, you're getting bullied at school, look to an alternative form of schooling. Go talk to one of those guidance counselors and try to get yourself set up in some type of homebound program or some form of alternative and get yourself out of there. And there are so many other ways that they could have handled the situation. But the whole point I'm trying to get at is that Eric Harris didn't want that. What he wanted was to just bring misery and destruction to other people. And I always go back to Dr. Julie Armstrong, who made this comment, not about mass shooters, but about serial killers, by saying that they experienced misery, therefore they want other people to experience misery. They felt powerless, therefore they want other people to feel powerless. And with Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, I think it's the exact same story. But there are a few pieces of media that I would like to respond to about the Columbine shooting, and these are movies and books. And the first one is actually a film called I'm Not Ashamed. And I watched this one, I think it was perhaps back in 2019, but it's a film from 2016. And I'll just read you this description here. I'm Not Ashamed is a 2016 American biographical drama directed by Brian Ball and is based on the journals of Rachel Scott, the first victim of the 1999 Columbine shooting and Columbine High School. Scott is played by Macy McLean, and she is portrayed as the protagonist of the film, and including the story of both gunmen Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, which is intertwined with hers. And the film I'm Not Ashamed is also about how the victim, Rachel Scott, just liked helping people, and she goes through all the good deeds that she did in her life before she was murdered in the Columbine shooting. And I believe it's from Pure Flix, and it is the only film from Pure Flix that I have actually watched. So, I just thought that it was one of the few times when we actually got to see an extended story behind one of the victims of the Columbine shooting who passed away. And there, of course, are lots of stories from the survivors. And there's a documentary that I also watched on YouTube called Columbine 20 Years Later, where not only the students who survived the shooting were interviewed, but also members of the faculty and the school board were also included in that. And as I said, it traumatized a lot of people. But in the film, I'm not ashamed. There were depictions of Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold as being the victims of very intense physical bullying, and other students in the school were also depicted as not only being bullied but also publicly humiliated. And they have these jocks who are wearing white hats, and they're allowed to wear white baseball caps in school. In my high school, you weren't allowed to wear any hats like that, but it was almost like this type of gang culture. Again, that's in the movie. And it turns out, though, that the film I'm Not Ashamed might actually have certain fictitious and creative liberties that were taken by the filmmakers, and it's not purely based on the stories and the journals of Rachel Scott. But at the same time, I think that sometimes that's justifiable when you're making a movie, and sometimes there's even the ability to tell a stronger story, and it's about the message, right? It's not as opposed to, well, did every single footstep that this person take actually happen? It's about the story that is left behind, which I do think is honest in its intention. And there is another one. Then there's a book that was actually written by Jodi Picoult called 19 Minutes that came out in 2007. And I read this book back in 2011, and you guys will notice that I spent a lot of time just sitting around in 2011 reading about books and watching YouTube videos. And that's also when I got pulled into the Zodiac Killer mystery, and there's some reasons why I turned to that one. Firstly, I didn't have a television at the time, so I ended up reading a lot more. And the book 19 Minutes by Jodi Picoult is a fictitious story, and it's based on the Columbine shooting, but it talks about how there's this gunman, and he is a consolidation of Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. It's almost like both aspects of the shooter are put into one character named Peter Hoden, and he commits a school shooting. And the book tries to answer a very challenging question, and that is, if someone has been the victim of bullying and goes on to commit an atrocity like a mass shooting, could he be found not guilty by mental disease or defect because he is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder? That is the question that is explored throughout the book, and that part is fascinating. The discussions on that in the book are absolutely fascinating, but the overall presentation, the conclusion of the book, horribly underwhelming. And if anybody would like to read the novel 19 Minutes and they want to discuss that with me, you can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. I mean, it's been, oh goodness, 13 years since I've read that book, but I mean, it's out of all the books that I read back in 2011, as I said, no television, so I ended up reading a lot more. That's the one that truly stood out the most, because I think that it's just all of the emotions, the negative emotions and the intensity, and talking about how all of the people who were committing the acts of bullying were not being punished in any particular way. And the fictional character, Peter Hoden, based on Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, is simply pointing out that when he was a victim, no one was there at his side, and when other people are victims, then the entire world is on their side. But that is still by no means a justification for committing homicide, and not only homicide, mass homicide. As I said, there are ways out. There are alternatives out, and the majority of bullying victims do not get homicidal. Instead, well, I mean, and this is actually going to sound a little bit dark, but I think a lot of people tolerate and push through the misery, and then they just go on to live normal lives after junior high or high school. And also, there's this aspect of high school bullying that I think is somewhat overly emphasized in fiction and literature and television and film. pertaining to high schoolers. I remember I was watching an episode of MTV True Life. It was True Life, I'm in a Wheelchair. And one boy was talking about how there was a lot of bullying and teasing in elementary school. Then he got to junior high or middle school, for what some people have. I went to junior high. And the bullying and teasing got so much worse. But then once he got to high school, it all stopped. And I was mostly in a similar camp. I mean, I wasn't overly physically bullied, but there's lots of teasing that happened in elementary school. And then in junior high, middle school, it got so much worse. Then I got to high school and it almost all completely stopped. So a lot of people get out of that phase. But then, as I said though, there's that story of Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, and like someone just pushes Eric in the hallway and he doesn't even respond to it because it was so normal for him to get pushed around by other people. I remember only one time that truly happened. I bumped into a guy in the hallway and he just shouted, "Get the fuck out of my way!" And I walked away from that. Oh my gosh, what's that guy's problem? Like, why is he acting like that? And yeah, I mean, I was being silly, so I bumped into him on accident, and he shouted like that. But I had the response that I think a lot of people would have had in that situation, like throwing my arms up in the air. It's like, oh my gosh, what a jerk. But they said that happened so frequently to them that it just became a norm, and it became a particular type of misery that they thought in their minds they wouldn't be able to escape, and they thought that there was no way out of that they would just be always social outcasts and rejects, and the only way that they could break the cycle was by committing an intensely destructive action that would ultimately lead to their own deaths, so that they could have power over the situation. The desire for power, mental derangement, homicidal tendencies, perhaps some natural-born psychopathy on the part of Eric Harris, manipulation of a vulnerable individual, Dylan Klebold, who was perhaps mentally unstable himself, who was mentally unstable himself to the point where he's going along with this plan for murder. I think all of these factors came together, and that the things like bullying and the lack of integration in their lives are just superficial factors. This is mostly an issue of two deranged people who society wasn't able to save. So what do you think about the Columbine shooting? And you can share your ideas in the comments section down below. Anybody can just give their take on the subject, or as I said, if there's another true crime case that you're curious about that hasn't been covered on Black Box Online Radio yet, you can also respond to that in the comments section down below. Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there was always BlackBoxNid88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.